At Walter Reed, everyone had a rank. Surgeons walked like gods, their white coats flowing behind them like royal robes. Nurses were angels in scrubs, saving lives with gentle hands and tired smiles. Patients were heroes, warriors who had bled for their country and now fought different battles in sterile rooms. And at the bottom, invisible, uncounted, worthless, the cleaning staff. Gloria Patterson was the oldest member of that staff. 6 years on the same shift, the same floor, the same rooms. No one knew her name. No one looked at her face. No one noticed the small gold star pin on her chest. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Soldier Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Gloria Patterson was 58 years old, a janitor at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland. Her world wasn't surgical suites or trauma bays. It was mops and buckets, industrial disinfectant and biohazard bags, the endless task of erasing the evidence of suffering so the next patient could arrive to clean sheets and spotless floors. She had memorized every tile in the 7th floor corridor, every scratch on every door handle, every flickering light that maintenance never seemed to fix. Every morning at 3:30 a.m., Gloria woke in her small apartment in Silver Spring, made herself a cup of instant coffee, and stared at the photograph on her kitchen table. A young man in army dress uniform, his smile bright, his eyes full of a future he would never see. Private First Class Marcus Patterson, 101st Airborne Division. Her son, her only child, killed in action in Afghanistan 6 years and 4 months ago. She kept the photo there so his face would be the first thing she saw each day and the last thing she saw each night. At 4 a.m., she caught the bus to the hospital. At 4:45 a.m., she clocked in, retrieved her cart, and began her rounds. The night shift was quiet, the halls empty except for the soft beeping of monitors and the occasional shuffle of nurses checking on patients. Gloria preferred it this way. The silence gave her space to remember, to pray, to exist in the liminal space between grief and duty. She always started on the 7th floor, the surgical recovery ward, the place where young soldiers woke up missing pieces of themselves, where they learned to live with new realities, where they fought battles that no one would ever pin medals on. Gloria cleaned their rooms with a tenderness that no one witnessed. She arranged their flowers when the vases tilted. She picked up fallen photographs and placed them where patients could see them. She did the small things that mattered to people who had lost so much. No one thanked her. No one noticed. That was fine. Gloria wasn't there for thanks. The gold star pin was tiny, barely half an inch across, pinned to the collar of her faded blue uniform. It was the mark of a gold star mother, a woman who had lost a child in military service. In any other setting, that pin would command immediate respect, solemn recognition, perhaps even tears. But at Walter Reed, where everyone was consumed by their own tragedies and triumphs, the pin was just another piece of metal that no one bothered to see. Gloria had stopped expecting anyone to notice years ago. She wore it anyway, not for recognition but for Marcus, so that some part of him was always with her, always present, always remembered, even if only by her own heart. The surgeons were the worst. Not cruel exactly, but indifferent in a way that cut deeper than cruelty. They looked through her as if she were made of glass, their eyes sliding past her face to focus on charts, on phones, on the next procedure. When they spoke to her at all, it was in commands. Clean that up. This room needs to be ready in 10. You missed a spot. Never please. Never thank you. Never her name. Dr. Nathan Cole was the chief of trauma surgery, a man whose reputation preceded him down every hallway. Brilliant, they said. Gifted hands. Saved more soldiers than anyone could count. He was also arrogant, dismissive, and utterly blind to anyone he deemed beneath his station. Gloria had cleaned his operating room hundreds of times, and he had never once acknowledged her existence beyond a curt nod. One evening she was mopping the corridor outside the surgical suite when Dr. Cole emerged, pulling off his gloves, his face tight with exhaustion. He nearly walked into her, stopped short, and sighed as if her presence was a personal inconvenience. "Could you not block the hallway?" he said, already moving past her. "Some of us have actual work to do." Gloria stepped aside without a word. She watched him disappear around the corner, his white coat billowing, his importance trailing behind him like a shadow. She dipped her mop back in the bucket and continued her work. The floor wouldn't clean itself. The patients deserved better than dirty tiles. That was the rhythm of her days. Invisible labor, invisible grief, invisible dedication to a place that had forgotten how to see her. But Gloria saw everything. She saw the young sergeant in room 714 who had lost both legs to an IED and woke up screaming every night. She saw the female lieutenant in room 702 who refused to eat because survivor's guilt had stolen her appetite along with her will to live. She saw the private in room 709 who pretended to be asleep when his parents visited because he couldn't bear to see the fear in their eyes. She saw them all, and she carried them in her heart the way she carried Marcus. Every wounded soldier was someone's child. Every broken body held a soul that deserved dignity. Gloria couldn't heal them, couldn't operate on them, couldn't prescribe medication or therapy, but she could make sure their rooms were clean, their flowers were fresh, their dropped belongings were returned to their nightstands. It wasn't much, but it was everything she had. The first clue that something was different about Gloria appeared one night when a young nurse named Esperanza found her sitting in the chapel at 2 a.m. The chapel was supposed to be empty at that hour, but Gloria was there, head bowed, hands clasped around something small and metallic. "Mrs. Patterson?" Esperanza approached softly. "Are you okay?" Gloria looked up. Her eyes were dry, but there was an ocean of grief behind them. In her hands she held a bronze star medal, its ribbon faded, its surface worn smooth by years of touching. "Just praying," Gloria said quietly, "for the boys on the 7th floor." Esperanza sat beside her. "That's a bronze star. Is it yours?" Gloria shook her head slowly. "My son's, Marcus. He earned it in Afghanistan." She paused. "He earned a lot of things in Afghanistan, including a flag and a headstone." The nurse's breath caught. "Oh, Mrs. Patterson, I'm so sorry. I didn't know." "No one does." Gloria tucked the medal back into her pocket and rose to her feet. "No one needs to. I'm just the cleaning lady." She smiled, a sad smile that held no bitterness. "But I see them, these young soldiers. I see them the way I wish someone had seen my son at the end. That's enough for me." She left the chapel, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. Esperanza sat alone for a long time, turning over what she had learned. The cleaning lady was a gold star mother. The invisible woman carried a bronze star in her pocket, and no one in the entire hospital knew. The second clue came from the patients themselves. Sergeant First Class David Chin had been at Walter Reed for 3 months, recovering from injuries sustained in a helicopter crash. He had lost his left arm, shattered his pelvis, and spent weeks in a medically induced coma. When he finally woke, the world was a blur of pain and confusion. But there was one constant. Every morning, no matter how early he woke, his room was already clean. His water pitcher was always full. The photograph of his daughter, which he kept on his nightstand, was always positioned so he could see it from his pillow. One night, unable to sleep, Chin pressed his call button not for a nurse but just for company. No one came. But through the crack in his door he saw movement in the hallway. A woman in a blue uniform pushing a mop, pausing outside his room. She didn't come in. She just stood there for a moment, looking through the window at him, her face soft with something that looked like maternal concern. Then she moved on, her cart squeaking down the corridor. The next morning, Chin asked a nurse about her. "The cleaning lady. Older woman, works nights. What's her name?" The nurse shrugged. "I don't know. They rotate so often." "Why?" "She stops outside my door every night, just for a second, like she's checking on me." The nurse didn't have an answer, but she mentioned it to Esperanza, who mentioned it to another nurse who started paying attention. It turned out that Gloria stopped outside every room on the 7th floor, every night for just a moment. Not to clean, just to look, just to witness, just to make sure they were still breathing. The third clue was the letters. After Marcus died, Gloria had written to every family in her town who had lost a child to war. Handwritten letters, pages long, filled with shared grief and hard-won wisdom about how to survive the unsurvivable. She never signed her full name, just "A Mother Who Understands." One of those letters had found its way to the mother of Lieutenant James Holloway, the patient in room 714. Mrs. Holloway had carried that letter with her for 4 years, through her son's deployment, his injury, his medevac to Walter Reed. She had never discovered who wrote it, but its words had kept her alive on the darkest nights. She visited her son every day, sitting beside his bed, holding the hand that was still attached to a body that was learning to live without legs. And every day she watched the cleaning lady work, something familiar tugging at her memory. Lieutenant James Holloway was dying. Not from his wounds. Those were healing, slowly, painfully, but healing. He was dying from something the surgeons couldn't fix. His kidneys had failed, damaged by the same blast that took his legs, and 3 months of dialysis had pushed his body to the breaking point. He needed a transplant. He needed it soon. And there were no compatible donors. His mother sat beside him, clutching the letter she had carried for 4 years, praying to a God who seemed to have stopped listening. Her son was 24 years old, had survived a war zone, had survived an IED, had survived the long flight home and the longer nights of recovery. And now he was going to die because of a kidney. Dr. Cole delivered the news with clinical precision. "We've exhausted the donor list. His blood type is rare, and the antibody profile makes matching nearly impossible. We have maybe 2 weeks, perhaps less." "I'm sorry." He wasn't sorry. He was already thinking about the next patient, the next surgery, the next life he could save. James Holloway was becoming a statistic, a number, a bed that would soon be empty and clean and ready for the next wounded soldier. Mrs. Holloway broke down in the hallway. She collapsed against the wall, her sobs echoing off the sterile tiles, her grief spilling out in waves that no one knew how to stop. Nurses rushed to comfort her. Doctors walked past with averted eyes. And Gloria Patterson, mop in hand, watched from 20 feet away. She had seen grief like this before. She had felt grief like this before. The day 2 officers knocked on her door. The day they handed her a folded flag. The day she learned that Marcus was never coming home. Gloria set down her mop. She walked toward Mrs. Holloway with steps that carried the weight of 6 years of invisible service and invisible sorrow. She knelt beside the weeping mother and took her hands. "What's wrong?" Gloria asked softly. "Tell me." Mrs. Holloway looked up through tear-blurred eyes. "My son, James. He needs a kidney and there's no one can save him. He survived Afghanistan, and now he's going to die in a hospital bed because of a kidney." Gloria's face didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes, a decision forming, a door opening. "What blood type?" she asked. "B negative. It's rare," they said. "B negative," Gloria repeated. She stood slowly, her knees protesting, her heart pounding. "I'm B negative." The testing took 3 days. 3 days of blood draws and tissue typing and antibody screening. 3 days during which Gloria continued her shifts as if nothing had changed. She mopped floors and emptied trash and checked on sleeping soldiers, her secret burning inside her like a second heart. She told no one. Not the nurses, not the doctors, not Mrs. Holloway. She simply appeared at the donation center during her break, submitted her paperwork, and waited for science to confirm what her soul already knew. On the 3rd day, Dr. Cole received the results. A perfect match. Kidney function excellent. Antibody profile compatible. A donor had been found for Lieutenant Holloway. He looked at the name on the file and frowned. "Who is Gloria Patterson?" A nurse checked the hospital directory. Janitorial staff. Night shift. 7th floor. Dr. Cole stared at the file. The cleaning lady. The invisible woman who mopped floors and emptied bedpans. She was offering her kidney to save a soldier she had never met, never spoken to, never been acknowledged by. "This has to be a mistake," he said. "Get her in here." Gloria arrived in his office still wearing her blue uniform, still carrying the faint smell of disinfectant. She sat in the chair across from his desk and met his eyes with a steadiness that surprised him. "You want to donate your kidney?" he said. "To Lieutenant Holloway?" "Yes." "Do you understand what that means? The surgery, the recovery, the risks." "I understand. You're 58 years old. This is major surgery. You could die on the table. You could have complications. Your quality of life." "Doctor." Gloria's voice was quiet but firm. "My son was 22 years old when he died in Afghanistan. He was someone's patient too somewhere before they put him in a body bag. No one could save him. No one could give him what he needed." She paused, her hands folded in her lap, her gold star pin catching the fluorescent light. "I can save this boy. That's all that matters." Dr. Cole looked at the pin. Really looked for the first time. The small gold star that marked a mother who had given everything. "You're a gold star mother," he said slowly. "For 6 years. And you've been working here, cleaning our floors, and no one knew?" Gloria smiled faintly. "No one asked." The surgery was scheduled for the following Tuesday. In the days leading up to it, word spread through the hospital in whispers and wide eyes. The cleaning lady was donating her kidney. The woman who mopped floors was saving a soldier's life. Had anyone known she was a gold star mother? Had anyone ever spoken to her? Nurses who had walked past her for years suddenly stopped to introduce themselves. Doctors who had never acknowledged her existence nodded in the hallways. Patients she had cared for in silence sent messages of gratitude and disbelief. Gloria accepted it all with the same quiet dignity she had carried for 6 years. She wasn't doing this for recognition. She wasn't doing this for thanks. She was doing this because her son was dead, and this boy was alive, and she had the power to keep him that way. The night before the surgery, Mrs. Holloway came to find her. Gloria was in the chapel again, sitting alone, holding Marcus's bronze star in her hands. Mrs. Holloway sat beside her and for a long time said nothing. Finally she spoke. "4 years ago when James deployed, I was terrified. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't function. And then I got a letter. A letter from someone who understood. A mother who had lost her child and somehow survived." She pulled the worn envelope from her purse. "I've carried it every day since. It saved my life. It taught me how to be strong for James, how to let him go do what he needed to do, how to wait and pray and hope." She opened the letter and read the last lines aloud. "Your child is a hero. No matter what happens, no matter how this ends, you raised a hero. And that means you are a hero too. Signed, a mother who understands." She looked at Gloria. "It was you, wasn't it? You wrote this." Gloria's eyes filled with tears she hadn't shed in years. She nodded, unable to speak. Mrs. Holloway took her hands, the same hands that had mopped floors and carried grief and would tomorrow give a piece of themselves to save a stranger's son. "You've already saved me once," Mrs. Holloway whispered, "and now you're saving my James. How can I ever repay you? Gloria squeezed her hands. Just let him live. Let him live the life my Marcus never got. That's all the payment I need. The morning of the surgery, Gloria walked into Walter Reed not through the service entrance she had used for 6 years, but through the main lobby. She wore a hospital gown instead of her blue uniform. She was a patient now, a donor, a mother making one final sacrifice. The 7th floor was lined with people. Nurses, doctors, patients in wheelchairs, staff members she had never formally met. They stood in silence as she passed, not applauding, not cheering, just bearing witness to something sacred. Dr. Cole met her at the hors doors. His face was different now, softer, humbled. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, "I owe you an apology. For every time I walked past you. For every time I didn't see you. For every time I treated you like you didn't matter." Gloria looked at him with eyes that held no anger, only grace. "You're going to save that boy today," she said. "That's all that matters. That's always been all that matters." She walked into the operating room. The doors closed behind her. The surgery took 7 hours. 7 hours during which the entire 7th floor held its breath, during which Mrs. Holloway paced the waiting room, during which stories of Gloria Patterson spread through the hospital like wildfire. A Gold Star mother. A janitor for 6 years. The letters she had written to grieving families across the country. The nights she had stood outside patients' doors, just watching, just caring, just being present when no one else was. By the time Dr. Cole emerged from surgery, exhausted but smiling, there were over 200 people waiting. "Both patients are stable," he announced. "The kidney is functioning. Lieutenant Holloway is going to live." The cheer that erupted shook the walls. Nurses wept. Soldiers saluted. Mrs. Holloway collapsed into the arms of strangers who were no longer strangers. And in a recovery room down the hall, Gloria Patterson opened her eyes to find her hand being held by a young man in a wheelchair. Lieutenant James Holloway, for lines trailing from his arms, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for giving me my life back." Gloria smiled through her own tears. "You remind me of my son," she said softly. "He would have been proud to serve beside you." 3 days later, when Gloria was strong enough to sit up, they brought her to James's room. He was recovering faster than anyone expected. The new kidney working perfectly, color returning to his face. His mother sat beside him, holding the hand that had almost died. The room was filled with flowers, more flowers than Gloria had ever seen. Cards covered every surface, from soldiers and families and strangers who had heard her story. A banner hung across the window, "Thank you, Gloria." But it was the people in the room that took her breath away. Dr. Cole stood near the door, no longer wearing his surgical mask of indifference. Beside him, hospital administrators, nursing supervisors, the cleaning staff she had worked alongside for 6 years. And in the corner, in dress uniforms that gleamed with medals and ribbons, a group of officers she didn't recognize. One stepped forward. A general, silver stars on his shoulders, his face solemn. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, "my name is General David Morrison, Chief of Staff of the Army. I'm here on behalf of a grateful nation." Gloria's heart stopped. "I don't understand. Your son, Private First Class Marcus Patterson, gave his life in service to this country. You have spent 6 years serving the soldiers he would have called brothers. And 3 days ago, you gave a piece of yourself to save one of them." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a velvet box. "This is the Silver Star, awarded for gallantry in action. It was meant for your son, but the paperwork was lost in the chaos of that day in Afghanistan. We found it last year, but we couldn't find you. You disappeared into a hospital, mopping floors, and no one knew where to look." He opened the box. The metal gleamed against red and blue ribbon. "It belongs to Marcus, but I'd like you to accept it on his behalf. And I'd like to tell you, mother to mother, that what you did this week, it's the bravest thing I've seen in 30 years of service." Gloria took the medal with trembling hands. The weight of it was nothing. The weight of what it meant was everything. "He was a good boy," she whispered. "He just wanted to help people. That's all he ever wanted." General Morrison saluted. The officers behind him followed. Then Dr. Cole, then the nurses, then the patients who had gathered in doorways and wheelchairs along the corridor. The entire 7th floor of Walter Reed Army Medical Center stood at attention and saluted a 58-year-old janitor with a piece of herself missing and her son's medal finally in her hands. Gloria didn't salute back. She didn't know how. Instead, she did what she had always done. She bowed her head, clutched the medal to her chest, and whispered a prayer for all the sons and daughters who would never come home. 6 months later, Gloria returned to Walter Reed, not as a janitor but as a volunteer coordinator, running a program she had designed herself. Gold Star families visiting wounded soldiers, mothers who understood, sitting beside patients who needed to be seen. Lieutenant Holloway walked her down the corridor on his new prosthetic legs, stronger every day, living the life that Gloria's kidney had made possible. "You know," he said, "I'm going to name my first daughter Gloria, if that's okay with you." Gloria smiled, the first full smile she had allowed herself in 7 years. Only if her middle name is Marcus. They walked together toward the 7th floor, where new patients waited, where new wounds needed healing, where invisible women were still mopping floors and carrying secrets that no one thought to ask about. But Gloria would see them now. She would always see them, because that's what Gold Star mothers did. They saw. They remembered. They gave until there was nothing left to give, and then they gave some more. Moral of the story: the greatest heroes are often the ones we walk past every day. Sometimes courage isn't loud. Sometimes it mops floors and donates organs and carries grief in its pocket without ever asking to be seen. If this story moved you, don't forget to show your support. Please subscribe for more soldier stories. We bring you true tales of courage, sacrifice, and honor. Stories that remind us of the quiet strength carried by those who serve. Until next time, stay safe, stay strong, and never forget the heroes among us.